Welcome everybody to a very special Creative Conversations in association with Tidelines, North Ayrshire's Book Festival. My name's Zoe Strachan and it's a great pleasure to be here with you all celebrating the launch of the wonderful new novel by Tidelines patron Andrew O'Hagan. So Mayflies is published today. So really we ought to be raising a glass to Andrew in the Harbour Arts Centre, but we're doing what seems to be the next best thing these days and gathering together on Zoom. Andrew, as you know, is the author of 5 other novels, as well as 3 works of non-fiction and plays and screenplays for which he's won numerous awards and been elected a Fellow of the Royal Society of Literature. His long-form journalism appears in Granta, The New Yorker, The New York Review of Books, and most notably the London Review of Books, for which he is editor-at-large. His publisher Faber fittingly describes him as one of the most exciting chroniclers of contemporary Britain. Now, tonight we might also want to call him a chronicler of Ayrshire, as all but one of his previous novels has featured a West Coast setting, whether as real as Rothesay or Saltcoats, or as reimagined as Dalgarnock. Mayflies takes us from Irvine to West Kilbride and beyond via one magical, memorable weekend of hedonism in Manchester. It's a novel of 2 halves, one a perfect, vigorous illustration of how our identities are forged by memory, and the other an intricate exploration of male friendship. And more than that, when I read it, I thought a lot about how what matters changes as we go through our lives. And the great success of the novel for me is that it captures that and manages to be about everything that matters. I'm a long-term fan of Andrew's work, but I think this is one of his very best novels. It's certainly, I have to admit, the one that has moved me to most. It's a bit of a 3-hanky number, let's say. And it's really delightful to welcome you here to celebrate it tonight. Thanks, Andrew, for joining us.
Hi, Zoe. It's such a pleasure to see you.
Lovely to be here. Shall we start, I wonder, can we start by talking about small towns? Because, of course, that really resonated for me when I was reading the novel, having grown up in a small town in Ayrshire, and recognising a lot of the peculiarities and pressures that you describe in the novel. What is it about small towns that makes them so rich for fiction, do you think?
I think it's right there at the very root of fiction. If you look at the history of English literature, if you look to Jane Austen even, I think she said it herself, just give me a parsonage and a couple of people in one country village and I'll give you world drama. And I think that that's a truth that is, shall we say, universally acknowledged. That if you come from a small town, you needn't waste your time as a writer thinking, why am I not in New York or Paris or London or elsewhere? As far as your creativity goes, you might want to go there physically, that's fine. Scottish people have been taking their imagination as a movable feast around the world since the beginning of writers. But certainly for subject matter, a small town is ample. I mean, I've found myself, my imagination flooded again and again with the small Ayrshire towns that I grew up in. I mean, I was only 2 years old when I came to live in Colwinning, in what was then called Irvine Newtown. And so those small towns of Colwinning, Stevenson, Saltcoats, Irvine, you know, they were the world to me. And my imagination, even yet, many books in, it's still the world of my imagination. And when I settled down into thinking about the complications of the human heart or society or the responsibilities of friendship, which became a subject in Mayflies, this most recent book, then automatically somehow I find myself back among those byways, housing estates, bus routes, chip shops, record shops, cafes, seafronts of my childhood. And it's the Ayrshire of the imagination.
And I think that's interesting because very early on in the book, there's a glimpse of how the world opens up beyond the small town through the library for Jimmy, the narrator. And suddenly there are all these other places and other stories. But certainly when I was growing up, Burns was omnipresent. Obviously, you know, one is forced to recite some Burns if you grew up in Ayrshire. But I don't know about you, I was quite unaware of the rest of Ayrshire's literary heritage. Nobody talked about Boswell, nobody talked about Galt. Was that something that has fed into your literary imagination?
I mean, I think my experience was quite like yours. I mean, I was kind of Burns haunted from quite a young age. You know, I was sort of parked beside a piano by Mrs. Ferguson, the wonderful headmistress of St. Luke's Primary School in Kilwinning, and told to sing along to My Love, She's But a Lassie Yet. I can still remember the words, My love, she's but a lassie yet, but let her stand a year or two. She'll no be half so saucy yet. I mean, we were forced to sing it. And that was Scottish literature in the classroom, you know, but I found myself, in my imagination, drawn to John Galt quite young. There used to be, and still is, I believe, I don't think the bank is there anymore necessarily in Irvine, but where the bank was in the High Street, one of the banks, there's a plaque, a metal plaque to John Galt. And I remember tracing that with my finger as a child and going round his head and thinking, what is it to be a writer who's remembered in cast in iron like this? And that was John Galt. And soon enough, via the library, I suppose, I found his great novel, Annals of the Parish. I mean, we started speaking about how a small town or a village is sufficient. Well, he proves it. One parish. And it has all the comedy and all the amazing sort of, irony of any of the world's great cities. Any conurbation would struggle to keep up with the great comic engine that John Galt exhibits in Annals of the Parish, but also in his other books, the Ayrshire Legatees, the Provost. I mean, he's a genius of Scottish literature, of world literature to me. And what he did was, I think, probably the first of the Industrial Revolution, post-industrial revolution novelists who wanted to somehow map the changes in small-town Scottish life. And so this minister, Micah Balwhidder, at the centre of that masterpiece, Annals of the Parish, which is his 200th anniversary is next year, 2021. There's a wonderful new edition of this book, just published by the Edinburgh University Press. I mean, there's never been as good an edition in terms of the notes, the introduction, the maps, everything brilliant. So as you can hear, I'm a real fan of that writer. He's a talisman for anybody who really cares about what happens in human lives in a small town far from the heart of things, you might say, or at least the urban buzz.
It makes me think, when you're speaking of the famous line in Alistair Gray's Lanark about the inhabitants of a city, in that case, not really inhabiting it themselves because they haven't seen it represented, so they can't inhabit it imaginatively. In Mayflies, a lot of that imaginative inhabiting happens through music. I wonder if that's more often the route that people in small towns take to think about, well, escape.
I think it was then, Zoe, to be honest. I think that there was a generation, we can now call it a generation, kind of Thatcher's children, or however you want to describe it, people who came of age in the 1980s. You've got to remember, before mobile phones, before the internet, before home computers, or many home computers anyway, we had a little BBC at school. I mean, I didn't see an Amstrad even until I had left university, not in the house. And so it was a generation where our fathers, as it were, had met men through national service and had made friendships in the pub or in the army. And our children, if we have them, they often make alliances on the internet. But there was a middle generation, which was mine, where people met at bus stops or in youth clubs or outside chip shops or in record shops, especially in record shops, where some heroic person who is flicking through the right bin and looking at music by The Fall or Cabaret Voltaire or The Smiths, suddenly your head would turn and you'd be interested in them, you know, because you knew their musical taste was like yours. So these alliances sprung up in a very different setting from the way they spring up now. And I think pop culture was crucial for my generation. I mean, this novel isn't about fandom. I mean, people who don't care about pop music will still see these human lives at the centre. They could be brought together by many things in other generations, but it just so happens that these particular boys are obsessed with each other's take on independent music in this sense. I mean, they wanted to please each other and be in league with each other, and they felt they were different from people who were in the mainstream and who followed the charts. You know, we were absolutely snobby about the music we liked. when we were teenagers. You know, you'd sort of, I mean, if you were interested in somebody romantically, I mean, the light could go out of your eyes if they mentioned the wrong band.
Definitely. And there's a real sense of that in the novel, of these friendships that are, I mean, forged at school partly, but forged by recognizing something in somebody's t-shirt, the way they've styled their hair, exactly
Yeah.
as you say, the record that will be carried rather than put in a bag so that the right people know. But at the center of it, there's this key friendship between Jimmy and Tully. And that's a thing that we visit in one way in the first half of the book, and then in the second half there is a phone call that throws that into very, very sharp relief for Jimmy. I wonder if you'd like to read from the book and give us a flavour for it, and give us your own introduction.
I'm going to read something, given what we've been saying about small towns and the vitality of them and the kind of notability of them and how all human life is here. That's certainly how I feel about them. And there's a scene quite near the beginning of the book where Jimmy, who's has plans to go to university all of a sudden, he hadn't expected to, but a very good teacher sort of unmasked him as a sort of budding intellectual, somebody who read books and cared about ideas. And, she really helped him out of what was a very sort of, a situation of some negligence where his parents probably didn't recognize that he was a reader or could go. And that was very common then. I mean, there was a lot of kids in housing estates that didn't get the chance to go to university and left school at 16. And he's on that track, but this teacher really helps him over the fence. So he gets a summer job working in Irvine Job Centre. I have to tell you and our viewers tonight that this is intensely autobiographical. There's no point in dodging that. And this is Jimmy, aged 18, in a summer job at Irvine Job Centre. Some days at the job centre were like Darwin on springs. Survival at the lippiest, I said to Rosa, who had come to work sporting red hair. Mid-morning, a mining engineer came in with a child in his arms. He said he'd been trying to get a position as an assistant in a local pet shop, and they told him he didn't have enough experience. I informed the mutt zoo manager on the phone that telling the engineer he was underqualified to change fish water was like the local minister telling God he was inexperienced. I'm going to complain to your boss, he said. Knock yourself out, I said. The day improved after that. One woman, 5 feet high with pink spectacles, who'd come in for an interview with Mr. Bike, told me at the front desk that she wanted to work for NASA. I asked her if she'd written to the people at Cape Canaveral. Aye, she said, and they haven't written back to me yet. I felt there was a lot of weight on the word yet. The lady admitted she had no experience in space aviation, but was determined. I feel sorry for all the astronauts that get blown up so a day, and I think they need people, brave people. Well, you are brave, Mrs. Gunyon, no question. When you go in for the interview, please tell my colleague there that what you've just told me, and perhaps add that you've looked into training opportunities in things, related to your chosen field. They're not allowed to cut your benefit if you're going after a particular career. Well, I am, she said. I won't settle for anything else. Right. I love space, she said. Good for you. It's my dream. They can't punish you for having a dream. Well, they shouldn't, Mrs. Gunyon, that's for sure. I've got all the information, she said. She was soon in the room with Mr. Bike, as I called him. My eyes were on the door. He would be in there, asking her questions about cosmic gases, loving his job, testing her knowledge of landing gear and pressurized suits. So, Mrs. Gunyon, long-term claimant, long-term unemployed, you're in a space shuttle returning to Earth. The trip normally takes 4 hours at 17,500 miles per hour. We want you home 30 minutes later than scheduled. by how much are you reducing your speed of re-entry? Come on, come on. You have 1 minute and you can't use a calculator. It was my last day at the job centre. It wasn't supposed to be. I was sitting at my desk contemplating the liquidation of Mr. Bike when Tully burst through the doors with an evil grin on his face. He wore a green army shirt, Levi's with turn-ups, brothel keeper's shoes and more bangles than a Maasai bride. He ripped a card from the computer assembly nonsense on the wall of jobs and slumped in the chair in front of me. "Nah, it's a dog's life if you ask me," he said, quoting from one of our films. "I have a deep desire, much deeper than you can imagine, to play goal attack for the Irvine netball team. Any vacancies?" "Let me have a look, sir." I started flicking through the cards in my box. The film reference game was going into full flight. "You're not much good at netball, are you, Joe?" I said, a taste of honey. "No, I'm bad on purpose." The same. "But hold on," I said. "There's a sporting life opportunity here. Head of keepy uppy at a school in Cowdenbeath." "Oh, it's a hard life if you don't weaken," he said. Saturday night. He slumped back in the chair. "You get more wisdom from one of those films than from the whole of Willie Shakespeare." "Oh, you don't half love a cloth cap," I said. "I'm telling you," he said. "Billy Liar is better than Hamlet." "If you say so, Tully. If you say it."
Thank you so much. It gave us a wonderful sense of the way in which Jimmy and Tully and their other friends communicate. And I thought that was so finely drawn in the novel because, yes, they're quoting the same quotes at each other that they always do, all those kitchen sink dramas that have meant so much to them, and a fair amount from The Godfather as well, which somehow seems to fit in the Ayrshire setting too. And it's real communication, isn't it? They're using someone else's lines, but it's reinforcing that friendship and allowing the closeness to grow, I felt.
I mean, that was so typical of the boys I grew up with and the girls. There was a crowd of us, and at one point it was a difficult job to get a sentence of your own into a conversation because we were so busy throwing lines at each other and, enjoying the fact that movies and music and poetry and all those things that matter to us could sort of be vocalized and could be part of your character, your group character. That the team, if you like, had a nature and we were all part of it. It's one of the cliches that I think journalists often apply to working class life in this country, is if everybody's a bit desperate, undereducated, unimaginative, gloomy. And I have to tell you that it wasn't like that in the housing estate I grew up in the west coast of Scotland. It was a gigantic, endless pantomime of some sort, as well as the difficulties that were happening, and we could talk about them. I mean, there were difficult times then, as is obvious from that extract. I mean, heavy industry was being decimated at that time in a place like Irvine. And part of the story that I've tried to tell here is about men of a certain age and women losing their footing, losing their livelihoods, and that affecting their relationship with their children. We're now at enough of a distance, I think, to look at that devastation in the 80s that was wrought on those communities, a lot of Ayrshire communities, elsewhere in the country too, obviously, where those cohesions that had existed were suddenly obliterated over 1984, 1985, 1986, the miners' strike being central to that experience in 84 to 85. And so I wanted to try and get that into a book, somehow to bring the joy and the sadness of that into that half of the book. I mean, those boys forged their friendship over those political determinations as well. I mean, they're very politically active. And contra the cliche, they're clever, those boys. And the girls, they're fully alive to the fresh changes in the culture and the new realities that are coming about, and they're critical of the Thatcher government.
And Tully's really at the centre of that. As a character, he's unpredictable. Sometimes he's quite obnoxious, but he's incredibly loyal and incredibly loving, and he enables things for other people. And one of the things seemed to be that element of foresight. There's a particular line in the book that stood out to do with the miners' strike and delivering cans to the food to the families of miners. And the word that's used is murder. He anticipates that what the government is doing, maybe unbeknowing, is murdering these people's lives. And
during that period, I mean, there was some high drama in our part of the world then. If you look at a town like Cumnock, New Cumnock, Auchinleck, a wee bit further down the coast from where I grew up, you know, the devastation was very real and the drama was intense because, you know, this almost alien culture of monetarism and of sweeping away people's lives without, you know, grief or care for them, and actually without any understanding of them either, of what their lives were and how the interdependencies in a small town like that worked. You know, they didn't realise, that government, that it wasn't a question of just closing an uneconomic mine, as they called it, but all the secondary industries, all the dependent businesses, they closed overnight too. And we did go to those villages. The person who inspired Tully, a friend of mine, Keith Martin, who inspired the character, he was very keen, as were others of my friends then. They'd been doing it before I came on the scene, of collecting groceries. Think about teenagers doing that these days, collecting groceries into boxes that they would then take to the door of striking miners. And the guy who inspired Tully, the main character in my book, I remember him saying to those miners, keep going, don't lose faith, solidarity, stick with the program, you'll win through in the end, one out, all out, you know, those kind of phrases. And, you know, he told me about them later, and he talked about them with a sense of enormous disappointment because, of course, that battle was not one that the miners could win, not with the government opposed to them the way they were at the time.
And when you were introducing your reading, you mentioned that this is deeply autobiographical. What negotiations do you have to make, if any, when you're writing in that way, when you're writing, modelling a character on a real person, a real friend, and their life and experience, and revisiting your own past and fictionalizing it? It's quite a process.
It's a very good question, that, because it goes to the heart of what we do. I mean, obviously, you need to take enormous care over it. I mean, there's an ethical requirement to take care of other people's stories as well as your own. It was made easier, I have to tell you, in this case, by the fact that the person who the book was modelled on asked me to write about us. You know, our friendship and the friendship with the whole group had been in a way so important to him that when he started to fade, he really felt it was important that, if possible, that it could be recorded, that it could be kept alive, that those stories would be kept in the air. So I was given kind of carte blanche by the people, and I asked others, you know, how they felt about that, and everybody was perfectly relaxed. I mean, the old crowd that I ran about with, you know, I sent them early proofs of the book and so on, and invited, you know, them to object if they had to, but nobody did. They were just delighted to see art being made of something that was familiar to them. That's how it seemed anyway. But it is always an interesting question, because it's been there in the novel since the beginning of it. You know, now into hundreds of years of experience of this great art form, the novel, and it's a perfect psychological machine for carrying human experience, I would argue. But there are ethical issues with it too. You've got to make sure that this imagined world you're creating, you're inviting readers into the comedy, the joy and the sadness of lives on the page, which are drawn somewhat, or to some degree, from reality. And of course, you also depart from reality when it suits you as a novelist. So you have your cake and eat it in a way on behalf of the readers. And these things have all got to be negotiated quite carefully. But the important thing is it needs to be true to the book, not necessarily true to the world or to history. It needs to be true to the reader's experience of the book. The only integrity that matters ultimately, I would argue, is that something needs to be right in terms of the narrative itself. You can't import, as it were, responsibilities and leave them under addressed in the final book. I think you need to solve all that in your head about your relationship with true experience or people's lives, and then go ahead and be free to write the book the way you think it should be.
And I think will be really resonant advice for a lot of the writers in the audience. And I know there are many there who may be grappling with these things too. It's something that carries over to your journalism, because sometimes, even you've written about, well, Julian Assange, but Grenfell, things that have probably, had a bit of a mixed reaction.
Oh, yeah.
Through pursuing that integrity of analysis of...
You've got to make your decisions clearly and professionally. And one of the things, as you know, Zoe, that happens as the decades go on, if you're a professional writer, is your technical skills become sharper. You become technically experienced. A lot of what we do as writers, we're trying to get people in and out of a room. We're trying to get, ourselves in and out of an epoch or a decade or a philosophy or a way of thinking. You're going in and out of consciousnness, in and out of societies that have changed. So these decisions have got to be incredibly, mulled over, including the moral questions. When it comes to journalism that you ask about, that sounds true there. I simply can't put a line into a non-fiction piece, a line of dialogue, unless I have it in my notebook or on my tape recorder. That's always been the way. There's different technical demands, but for me, if you're trying to write well, you'll try and write a postcard well. You're not in the business of writing rubbish sentences. If you're, you know what I'm saying? Sometimes you hear people say, oh, well, when you put on your special shirt when you're writing your novel and you care about accuracy and morality and responsibility, but at other times it's just sort of dashed off. I don't know about dashed off. I'm not interested in dashed off writing. And it's just, it's a form of obsessive compulsion, trying to get it right, and on behalf of your readers. And in journalism, that brings heady responsibilities. I was locked in a house with Julian Assange for a year. I'll show you the scars if you like. And that brought with it a gigantic responsibility to make sure that the picture that I was offering of his goals, his politics, his personality, his illusions had to be utterly right, and I had to be able to back it up with what I'd observed and what I'd recorded and the notes that I'd made. So I take all that quite seriously. You have to. And of course, as you indicate, there will be criticism out there, because every time you try and describe reality, you're dealing in something called perspective. And your perspective, even as a supposedly objective recorder, is still a perspective. And there'll be somebody on the other side of the hill whose perspective is different from yours, and they'll be unhappy with your account of it. So you must always be ready for that, and ready to, as it were, turn the camera towards their perspective if you can. That, in my view, is good reporting, but non-fiction brings with it hell of a technical and moral responsibility.
And I think, being able to shift the perspective like that is, of course, central to fiction, or else, the novel wouldn't function very well if if the bad guys were all just bad and nothing else to it, no motivation.
No, as you well know, sometimes the most morally obtuse and objectionable people are fantastically interesting human beings. If you don't believe me, ask Shakespeare. That Iago isn't, he might be hateful, but he's never boring. And that's what you're dealing with as a writer, I think, very often, is how to cope with humanity as it is and as how it might be. And you don't just turn off or dim your headlights because there's somebody grotesque up ahead, or somebody objectionable who doesn't have your politics and who you don't like. I think it's an act of brilliant feminism for a writer to be able to imagine brilliantly and clearly a misogynist, for example. You don't turn your lamps off. You might absolutely disparage them and hold them in contempt, but your job as a novelist is to make them real on the page, or make them live or breathe somehow within the picture that you're trying to create.
And it's quite at odds with a lot of our communication culture today, isn't it, with social media and so on. It's not a communication of nuance. It's not a communication of spending time with others' points of view. and or
Yeah,
as they trying to appreciate
yeah.
where the things that we find abhorrent are coming from.
I think that you're absolutely right about that. I mean, it's a brave and important statement, that because we're living, I'm afraid, through a period. It's a bad period for ambiguity. It's a bad period for objectivity. That the attempt to be objective can appear to some people almost to carry an agenda with it. You're trying to be objective, as if it's a kind of betrayal of their version of the truth. You don't cleave to their sense of right and wrong. That's an unfortunate state of affairs for writers. Writers need to find their way all the way around a moral problem. They need to find a way to look at it from every angle, not in order to promote it or to give it airtime or whatever the oppositionalists say, but in order to understand it. And that's as true of fiction writers, I feel, as it is of journalists. We're living through fanatical times. And I'm afraid it's not a job of writers to make ourselves the favourites of the fanatics. It's our job, if need be, to introduce the strange, difficult, and complex and sometimes uncomfortable questions that fanatics don't like, fanatics of every stamp. So you raise it, and I think it's right to raise it because we're living through that. And I think you can't really have a grown-up conversation about writing in 2020 without realising that not everybody wants writers to, as it were, be hospitable to complexity, that readers need us to be. Readers are more intelligent than I think some people give them credit for. And I wouldn't be able to sit here if it wasn't for the intelligence of readers. I believe in them, and I'm not going to insult their intelligence by loading the argument all one way, my way.
Which takes us back to Jimmy and Tully growing up and having access to the library and to these books that might be considered just so alien. Jimmy reading about the Sitwells or, about salons in Paris and that sort of thing, and allowing his world to grow larger and have different possibilities.
I had a wonderful English teacher, and she passed away a couple of years ago, and she was just a wonderful influence on me at that age. And I was reading sort of Edwardian aesthetes, while I was living in a sort of housing estate in Kilwinning, and I'd come in with these bizarre accounts of people's lives, the Sitwells or Oscar Wilde or, Andy Warhol, writers and artists. And I remember her saying to me, you need to travel. You need to maybe think about getting out of here for a while. And she lived here. It wasn't a statement against where she lived. It was a way. She's the first person in my life who said to me, it might be important for you to go and see how other people live. And I think that was a gift, actually. And that's gone into the book. James in the book is told to leave the classroom, and so he's too weird. Away you go and find something out about the world, because weirdos have to do that. And so that, in a sense, was autobiographical too, that the urge to find out what it was like on the other side of the hill. And that's a primal urge for writers, I think. You just, it can cause them a lot of pain, because there's something nice about settling down and settling in and feeling at home where you started. But writers are not often that good at that. For all they admire and are interested in small towns and everything, they need to be able to compare that small town to something else, if only the small town on the other side of the hill.
And that struck such a chord for me when I, read about the teacher. I thought, gosh, where would we be without these people who take the time to teach properly or recognize something, or just give you that tiny bit of information that you didn't have, that you could go and study English, for example, or, something like that.
I mean, I came from a family with 4 boys, and they all left school at 16. I was the last. I got the opportunity, and I see it that way. They were bright boys, but I got the opportunity to stay on at school, go to university. They all had trades. They had apprenticeships. And I stayed on, and sort of that teacher, that brilliant Ayrshire teacher there at St Michael's Academy in Kilwinning, Mrs McNeil, gave me that opportunity to just, try life differently. She knew I came from a working class house, and there wasn't a lot of books in the house or a lot of examples of how to do it that way. But she gave me an example. and that's all you need, one good teacher.
It's great. I can see that questions are starting to appear in the chat, which is great. So please add some more, and Andrew will have time to answer some of them.
Sure.
I wanted, though, to pick up on another aspect of the book that we haven't really talked about, which is that central, incredible weekend in Manchester, and is such a feat of comedy writing apart from anything else. There is so much humour in the misadventure of these boys on their big weekend away. I sensed autobiography in that as well, I have to say.
Oh yeah, that was a real concert in Manchester on the 19th of July 1986. I was 18, had just turned 18, and there was a group of us went from Irvine, went up to Paisley, then went up to Glasgow, got the bus down to Manchester. The whole thing was actually fresh and ready to be written about. The comedy that you mentioned was sort of part of our everyday lingua franca. It was part of our experience. I didn't have to drum that comedy up out of thin air. It was actually waiting there for me in a way. I had to recreate it. I mean, it wasn't recorded by me and I didn't have notes. I had to make it again, but it was absolutely possible because each of those individuals who became characters in the book had very strong personalities. They actually had singular voices. When it came to reading from the book, from the early drafts, I mean, the people who do audiobooks came to me right away when they heard me and said, can you do the audio version of the book? Because we can hear the difference between all these characters. And I could hear them in my head because I grew up with them and they had distinctive ways of speaking. And that was part of the comedy, the great sort of tumbling towards Manchester and having just the time of their lives. I mean, that's one of those phrases you hear too much, but they were having the time of life. It was the summit of their youth. And after that, they'd all go into different places and change their lives and change their responsibilities, accept their responsibilities, I suppose you would say. But there was that weekend, the summer before university for Jimmy, where they just came to the summit of their friendship. And then, of course, as the book describes, it then stops there. And 30 years later, a terrible phone call comes that Tully has had terrible news. And therefore, the responsibilities of friendship turn a corner then. We're into adult life. This is 30 years later. And I wanted the book to be that, Zoe. From the beginning, I knew that this was going to be a book of two halves, a bit like one of the football games they so admired, and that it was going to be 30 years later when I tried to give an account for readers of what actually happens to a friendship over the course of a life. How does your dependency, how does your admiration, how does your love, how does your need and responsibility change? We've all got friends like that, and we all live with that. We ask ourselves, what is my job now if a friend is ill or a friend has a terrible crisis in their life 30 years on? All that breezy innocence of life is suddenly thrown into a new place.
And it is a friendship between men. I think when I was reading the Manchester sections, I thought, yes, I could sort of step into this or understand it or have a parallel. As the book develops and there are female characters who are very, very central, particularly in the second half of the book, there are things that are picked out that make it clear that, I suppose, just that there's something specific about how these men, but perhaps how all men, all Scottish men, Ayrshire men, I'm not sure, form a close relationship. And I thought that was evoked very clearly and in very interesting ways.
I think that, as you know, I think it's right. I mean, books are not generalities. Bad books are generalities, but books that are trying for something else they're a kind of feast of specificity. They're about the specifics. The specifics in the first half of this book, Mayflies, is that they're young boys and they hang out with each other. It'd be bad writing to falsify that account. If you're going to write about that, about Ayrshire in the 1980s and a group of boys who are bonded in various ways by music and experience and politics and working class culture, then it would be utterly false to suddenly stud their group with a few feminists, throw in a few lesbians, throw in a few, just to somehow appeal to an audience that you think might like to see that. That would be stupid. We all have a specificity in terms of who we're writing about. And It was the same when it came to people of colour. There was an issue in that culture that they grew up with, that it was actually a culture that was, in some senses, quite racist. And there's a scene, several scenes in the book, where a Jamaican man who drinks in the local pub doesn't get any attention from the rest of the white working class men in the pub. Now that's provocative and challenging for readers, but to my mind, within the context of the book and the world that it's trying to describe, it's true. It's an under-described area of our culture, that working class culture can sometimes be racist, and that, you know, trade unions in the 1970s in places like Glasgow, when it came to the corporation buses, were not keen to employ or to have as union members Afro-Caribbean men. Now, that's just a subject that, it's an area of specificity that I wanted to get into the novel as a truth and as a part of the drama. It's not there for any other reason than that those boys were political and they cared about it. They noticed. I mean, 30 years on, that would be a major, major issue, as it is in our lives quite rightly now. But there were seeds for that kind of political engagement in our lives, and a lot of them were in the 80s. We started to really notice that society needed renovation, if not absolutely revolutionising in some ways.
It's a shame, isn't it, when we look back and think, is it every generation's turn to think that at one point? Does it get better every iteration or not?
I think it's part of the glory of life, you know, that every generation, especially when it's young, wants to rip it up a bit. Rip it up and start again, as the man said. And, you know, the 60s generation had a burden of responsibility about changing that kind of war generation mindset and introducing new freedoms. In the 70s, a hippie generation sort of took that a bit further. The women's movement arrived. These are important revolutions in our life. It's not just a stage we went through. I mean, you're right, we didn't get there. We're still trying. And I look at young people now and think, good on you. Throw us all in the bin.
Not too soon, not before.
Not too soon.
Not too soon. Should we go to a question from the chat? Actually, Colin, I can see them, or I will shout if I get lost. David is asking if at the time that when you're writing about the past in your life, did you document it in any way? He's talking about having tapes of music, letters to friends, songs, stories, that sort of thing. So did you have material, actual physical material to delve
That's
in?
a lovely question, actually, because it's sort of, you know, it's like a writer's question, that, because of course we always, I remember Joan Didion saying, you always are obsessed with, have I got the notes? Have I got the stuff? You know, no matter what your story is, and I've written about a lot of different topics, you know, Hurricane Katrina, I was there, and, you know, watching the behavior of the American military there. I was with child jihadis in Afghanistan, you know, interviewing them in Kandahar. And the question always is, have you got your stuff? Did you get the material? Is it recorded? Did you have good notes? And in relation to my own childhood, I didn't make notes. I had diaries to some extent. I had a lot of letters, and we had tons of mixtapes. I mean, we swapped mixtapes a lot when we were young, and I was able to find a lot of them. And then my friend Keith and other friends started sending me letters and listicles, enormous emails full of the kind of Proustian memory of Ayrshire and music and love affairs and seascapes from the 1970s and 80s and 90s, and rave culture and places we'd gone and things that had been said and noticed and overlooked, or politics that hadn't quite connected. You know, all of it came in letters and emails, but I did have some of my own, and it all just came together. But it was absolutely singing out to be made into a novel, because I just felt, as you sometimes do as a writer, that you want to write the book that you yourself would like to read. You know, I hadn't read that book, and I thought that if I wanted to read it, maybe other people did as well.
I think it's the best guide, isn't it? Why would you write it if you didn't want to sit down and read it yourself?
Sure.
The book festival, Siobhan perhaps, is asking if the book could have been set in any of the post-industrial areas, or is there something that's unique about the Ayrshire experience that lent itself to this?
That was, as far as I'm concerned, the crucial decision for starting the book in Irvine. It's not just because I come from there. I mean, I've lived in a lot of places. I've lived in London for quite a long time. I come originally from Glasgow, and I'm interested in towns and cities of various sizes around the world. It was Irvine, partly because that drew on the autobiographical energy in the book, but also for another reason which might interest you, Vaughan, and it is that Irvine Newtown in those years was characterful in a particular way. It had a lot of families like mine came from as overspill, we used to call it, out of places like Glasgow, where when they cleared a lot of the slums and cleared the tenements away, a lot of those working class families were rehoused in places, well, the new towns particularly, if not in tower blocks in the periphery of the city or in housing estates in the periphery of Glasgow, like Castlemilk and Drumchapel and so on. Quite a number of them went to places like East Kilbride or Irvine, Newtown. And we went to Irvine exactly in that way, that we were decanted out of the old city. And what came with that was an enormous sense of expectation. We didn't think we're just going to another house. We were coming to Irvine by the sea, near Saltcoats, near Troon, near Ayr. Ayr had ice skating. There was a swimming baths in Stevenson. You know, there was the seascape. There were seagulls would land on your windowsill in the morning. This was all a kind of fantasy of improvement. And indeed, when you look at the philosophy behind the Scottish New Towns, the fantasy of improvement is slightly what it was. You know, it was about come to Livingston, come to Cumbernauld and have a better life, be a better person. When you look at the sketches the artists made for the architectural sketches, they always present these incredibly tall, slim people wearing a beautiful suit, walking through Cumbernauld, you know, with flyovers and underpasses and beautiful cars and people smiling at their children. I mean, quite fantastical. I mean, I'm sure some people did smile at their children. There wasn't a lot of smiling at your children and some days in the 1980s. But you know, I make comedy of it, but in actual fact, that seems to me pretty much true, that the experience of coming to Irvine Newtown was about coming to a place where it would be a perpetual holiday, because this was thought of as a place that was, you know, down the water, a place of enjoyment and leisure time, as well as new industry and work and new schools. So the newness aspect was very contagious. So I think it defined the kind of morality of our childhood, if you like. I mean, I don't know if Siobhan would see it that way, but it's certainly for us, it was different from just going to any other town. If we'd just been decanted to a house in, you know, a well-established place like Paisley or off to Edinburgh or off to Aberdeen or Dundee, I don't think I'd been able to write about it in this way. You know, the impact of the 80s on our lives was specifically to do with that town and what had happened there.
And I remember you wrote about it in the LRB, I mean, I think quite a while ago, and there was a lovely phrase that you used that stuck in my mind about imagining you were going somewhere with no past and no dark secrets, and that it felt like walking on the moon, being in Irvine Newtown, in this place that I suppose seemed like a place of the imagination. But of course, as the novel and other things that you've written show, we don't really get to leave the past behind. We kind of drag it along with us in a little wheelie case, and it, you know.
Well, it is the stuff of fiction, you know, that fiction, if you like, is a little moral machine that gives people their lives back, gives them the stuff of their lives and the specifics that they might have forgotten about. And the common experience becomes storytelling, you know. And it was like walking in the moon for some people. I mean, a lot of people who were coming into these newly built housing estates in new towns in Scotland had come from tenements with no inside bathroom. And when we arrived in our house in Pennyburn, Colwinning, the council had tied red ribbon round the taps in the bathroom. Now just think about that as a storyteller. My mother immediately stripped her clothes off, dunked us into the bath, ran the taps, you know, bubble bath. This was new, this whole promise. And so both the promise and certain sort of failures that came after the promise through the Thatcher years, that becomes a story. That becomes mythic in your life if that's the life that you lived. So you don't just randomly pick a town and set a story in it. It has to emerge with all of that culture, all of that hope and belief and change attached to it. Then you're getting into the commonality, because other people had that experience too. There'll be people watching this who had that Bath experience, or who had that sense of going to a new town, where when they put wallpaper on the wall of the sitting room, or the living room as we would have called it, that was the first wallpaper ever to go up there. Maybe generations later you see 4 or 5 layers of it, but that was the first. The smell of emulsion was everywhere in that housing estate. That was part of the joy.
Lynn's got a question as well about the earlier conversation about authenticity and authenticity of time and place. And she's asking if there's any part of a time or place or person that you would find taboo to novelise.
Gosh, that's a good one. I mean, I would find it difficult to control myself in relation to certain topics. I mean, for example, if I was to write a sort of fictionalised biography of the life of Donald Trump, I would find that very difficult to make good, because I find him so off the chart in terms of unreasonability and racism and sexism and all those things that sort of matter so much to us now. I find him sort of beyond the pale, both in fact and in imagination. So my imagination couldn't climb to the place that it would need to go to find the novel. I'd stop myself at the gates. I'd be so repulsed by the project. So that would be something like that would be very hard to contemplate. But also, when it comes to authenticity, to try and get closer to the questioner, I think sometimes nowadays you would stop short of assuming interior knowledge of a whole culture that wasn't yours. I mean, I don't know that I was ever the kind of writer that would have written, as it were, tried to write the great Indian novel. I mean, believe me, there are British men who did, many of them, you know, from Paul Scott and even E.M. Forster, very good writers. You know, that colonial mind, I think, has been stamped out for our generation, sometimes too much, arguably, that, you know, you can bring a character into a novel who isn't, as it were, from your classroom, who didn't grow up with you and who isn't wholly your culture. I think imaginative writers, this is to my position I'm stating here, I think we have to allow imagination to actually do its work. But to be one of those colonizers of a whole culture and sort of put a British stamp on experience that you really had no interior knowledge of, I reckon I wouldn't. I wouldn't try, and I don't think I'd do it well. And you never want to be in a position of writing books knowing that you're unlikely to do them well. So we're in difficult times for that, because of course appropriation is a big subject now. It goes too far in some directions, but it has got a point.
And we've got time, I think, for maybe 1 or 2 more questions. Janice has asked where the title comes from, and I feel that you can't answer that, because finding out where it comes from is such a lovely moment in the novel, Janice. So I don't know, Andrew, if you want to, if you're
I can
happy
say something about titles generally. I mean, obviously Mayflies as a word, it's a very attractive word, I think, because we live with that. I mean, those insects, mayflies, which famously live a very short life. I mean, some of them only live for a day. I mean, they, as it were, pupate and come out and fly and, you know, reproduce all in one day, or in 2 days, you know. But the point is that it was a wonderful metaphor for these boys' lives, you know, that because the second half of the book, it moves from joy into, without giving too much away for you and spoiling it for you, it becomes a very sad story, and things don't go entirely 100% well in the lives of this group of boys. And, you know, that's the journey. And it was like the journey of mayflies. They flew so high, so fast, so radiantly in the afternoon sun. And then it was quickly the realization that this could come to an end so fast. We're all just a glimmer. And I think that title was right for the book as soon as it occurred to me. The titles, I mean, we could do an hour on titles. I mean, I won't bore you, but, you know, some books, as you know, Zoe, they come with their title stamped on them, like Blackpool Rock all the way through. And then other titles you fight for. I mean, it's a climb, a steep climb without ropes to find the title to some books. You know, you have titles on the manuscript that sit on the manuscript through draft after draft, and then you realise it's not right. Titles are important, obviously, but Mayflies came quite early in the process, and as soon as it occurred to me, and as soon as I saw it on the page, I said, that's it. Done.
I think that's a gift, isn't it, when the title arrives and sticks.
Yeah.
One more from Linda, this is a good one. She's asking, do you think the magic of the experience of the group fostered the Bath experience, fostered that positive collective of your young group of friends? You're really shining when you remember your 80s time of hope and determination to push change. So I suppose, is it that magic of that particular move when you're very young and those memories that maybe totally crystallize?
I mean, I think that is the Scottish Newtown experience, is that you were handed an agenda almost. We built this for you. This is something we built for you. This isn't a house, many of them beautiful, many of them we would desire now as adults. This isn't a house where it has been here since 1885, and you know, dozens of families have lived and died here and brought up children and put wallpaper in the walls and run their hand down the banister and sort of, you know, enjoyed these tiles. And no, this is a house in Irvine Newtown or Cumbernauld or Livingston that was built for you, for your generation, to live better lives, to be cleaner, to be more moral, to be more of a community, to be more community-minded and caring, to die well, to, you know, to be in a cradle-to-grave sense, looked after. All that belief in a little house, a little 2-bedroom council house, you know, in something that used to be a field somewhere a few miles from Kilmarnock. You know, it's a lot to load into that wee space, but let me tell you, for us, that's what was loaded into that space. We felt we had a lot to prove, that we had to prove worthy of those new houses. And then when things started to go wrong in the communities, when the industries were lost and, you know, perhaps dark forces started to be recognisable in that very bright place, well, that was human experience happening. But you know what? It gives rise to storytellers and to people creating, as it were, something on the page that will permanently stand as a marker for the experience those people had there. You know, and that for me, growing up, was what made a book great. You know, I loved reading about periods of life that I wouldn't reach had they not been set down in books and in plays and in poems that, you know, made me who I was. You know, you're made by the books and the poems and the plays that you love.
Definitely. There's another lovely observation there about the pacing of the novel and how the trip to Manchester and that sort of hedonistic intensity is really well matched by the emotional pacing of the second half of the novel. I think we don't have time to go into it, and I don't want any spoilers about the second half of the book, because I really recommend hugely to people that they either through Waterstones and Ayr, the festival bookseller, get hold of Mayflies, or through John Smith, Creative Conversations bookseller, or wherever else you like to buy your books. You will want to spend time with this book, and if you're anything like me, you will really want to reread it as well. I think it's a new Ayrshire classic. Andrew, I really enjoyed talking about it.
It's lovely talking to you. Can I just say, Zoe, before we lose each other in the audience, I know these are difficult times. It's hard to do these events. We should all be in a hall somewhere and then lifting a glass later on. But I'm just appreciative to this audience and to you for taking the trouble, albeit across Zoom and online. It's been a really lovely way to launch the book today for me. So thank you, all of you, for making the effort, taking the trouble.
Thank you, Tidelines Festival, for letting us be part of your programme this year at University of Glasgow. Thank you very much, Colin Herd, for all his help setting this up. As Andrew says, thank you for so many of you coming. I hope you've enjoyed it. I think it's just been a wonderfully wide-reaching conversation that illustrates so many of Andrew's thoughts and his experience as a writer. Thank you very much.
Cheers to all of you.
Thank you. And you're right, this is the odd bit. Please go and raise a glass to Andrew and Mayflies in the privacy of your own socially distanced home, which is, if you're in Glasgow like I am, where you'll be staying for a while.
Thank
Good
you,
night,
Zoe. Thank
everybody.
you so much. I really
Thank
appreciate
you very
it.
much.
All of
Goodbye.
that. Bye-bye.
2, 3, 4.